Before we hear from Niels, though, you got to hear from Dan Peterson. Dan is a professor of theology at Seattle University. He formerly studied with Bob and Ted, but unfortunately he has his own ideas. And he thinks that I am wrong and Niels is right. So let's hear from Dan.
What I find interesting is that the disagreement that Ted and I are going to have here, and to the largest agreement we have, but with one major difference, is actually an exegetical disagreement. So I was a student in systematic theology at the GTU under Ted. Ted's a systematic theologian, and we're having an exegetical argument. It seems kind of strange here. But what I want to argue essentially is that the notion of deep incarnation we've heard about is really not a radical form of kenosis yet. I'm going to suggest that it's, or at least raise the question, is this form of kenosis sufficiently radical? What I want to do is endorse a theologically heterodox understanding of deep incarnation, which is paradoxically closer to Scripture, one that presupposes a total self-emptying or kenosis on the part of God as a precondition, perhaps, as a precondition for the exercise of divine power in the world. In this way, I'm calling up the spirit of H.L. Martinson in response to this successor of him at the University of Copenhagen. So we'll see if this works. My basic argument is this. Following Ted, he challenges Professor Gregerson on the issue of kenosis and remarks that such a withdrawal in his article implies that the existence of divine power is incompatible with the exercise of creaturely power. God must, in this understanding of kenosis, pull back or withdraw to give God's creatures space to exercise free and independent agency. Unfortunately, Peter says, this exercise of self-restraint makes it difficult to determine whether, at, quote, higher levels of nature, God's action makes a difference. And Ted raised that question again in his presentation. We can affirm that divine action coincides with quantum events, but to say at a higher level that God is simply pulled back to give God's creatures space essentially affirms God's absence at that level. That's how I understand the criticism. This criticism, I submit, rests upon a problematic definition of kenosis. Kenosis is not a withdrawal or self-restriction of God, and I disagree here with Jürgen Moltmann as well. Rather, it marks the self-emptying of God, or what Thomas Altizer, a Death of God theologian, calls the metamorphosis of God, one where God negates God's self in one form to be manifest or to become manifest in another. This self-negation generates the power of life and history and makes it possible, as Gregerson does, to affirm a non-interventionist form of divine power and presence beyond the level of quarks and quanta. So the basic argument I'm going to make is this. Peterson's critique rests upon a faulty understanding of kenosis based upon a misreading of texts in Scripture. One. And then two, the Bible doesn't run away from God's power, as Ted said in his presentation, it redefines it. So I think that's the crucial issue that I have with Ted's critique of the position here. So the trouble I'm suggesting is exegetical. Peterson assumes what I would call an isolationist reading of Philippians 2, 6 through 7, one that reduces the truth of a theological proposition to a particular passage or proof text in Scripture. Biblical scholars ranging from Richard Elliott Friedman to Gerhard von Rad have observed by contrast what I would call a drift in the broader narrative chronology, say, of the Old Testament. One where God gradually disappears over the course of the entire canonical progression of texts. When Peters accordingly cites Deuteronomy 26, verse 8, again by way of proof text, to argue that God in the Hebrew Bible was one who acted with power, he ignores the progression of the biblical record. Yes, God acted with power according to Deuteronomy. But by the time we come to the Psalms and Isaiah, God has hidden God's face. And by the time we get to Esther, God has been virtually forgotten. That's the reason that Martin Luther considered excluding Esther from the canon, at least his canon within the canon. It never mentions God once. For his part, Friedman concludes that God has withdrawn according to this overarching narrative, perhaps, as our theologians contend, to provide a space for the exercise of human autonomy. This, however, need not be the only way of reading the data. One might also account for the disappearance by affirming that heaven pours itself out into history, that God above disappears in the act of coming near. And I think you could argue that deep incarnation presupposes, or could presuppose, this kind of radical self-emptying on the part of God. Not to withdraw, but to become absolutely and closely tied up with creation. The beyond, as Bonhoeffer says, is therefore no longer up there, but now in our midst. What I want to identify here, there are a number of other passages I'd like to highlight, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to highlight one, and not really passage, but pattern. That's the way I'm reading the Bible over and against the way Ted reads Scripture, at least in this case. I'm going to argue that the Gospel of Mark recapitulates this disappearance of God that we find in the Old Testament, according to scholars like Friedman and von Rad. We see, in other words, a similar transition over the course of Mark's narrative. Consider the drift of the story. God's voice booms from the sky only twice in all 16 chapters of Mark. Once in chapter 2 and once in chapter 9. By the time Jesus gets to Gethsemane and the cross, our Father who art in heaven is utterly silent. Such an absence need not point to withdrawal, as Moltmann and others, I believe, have incorrectly concluded. So there I would agree with you. Instead, is symbolized directly by an event that occurs just after Jesus dies. God and world have come together. God has emptied God's presence into the world, which explains the silence Jesus encounters from above, converging with it through Christ, as symbolized by the tearing of the temple curtain, torn as it was from top to bottom. Now, a Lutheran pastor pointed this out to me. It is from top to bottom that this occurs. It is by God's initiative that God has closed the gap between God's self in the world, and the world is symbolized by the tearing of the temple curtain. The estrangement between God and world has thus been overcome. This is kenosis into the world, one so powerful it resurfaces in and through the resurrection of Christ. So, again, the basic difference here is how we read kenosis. The self-emptying of God in the process of creation provides, finally, a way of defining kenosis that brings with it an explanation for how God empowers finite realities in the world. God empowers by negating God's self. Each moment of being and new being, of creation and new creation, or of what Paul Tillich calls the courage to be, presupposes this self-divestment of God. This self-divestment or negation gives history and life its momentum. It is the power that empowers, but it does so always by giving itself up. This is where God and soccer moms part ways. This becomes the basis for a distinctively Christian form of power, one that appears at all levels of being. As such, we can affirm what Gregerson affirms, a non-interventionist God who nevertheless empowers us, albeit through the power of love, that is, God's own self-sacrificial emptying at the higher levels of human reality, namely as their presupposition as well as their quantum ground. This avoids the tyrannical notion of power that non-compatibilists like Moltmann or Polkinghorne rightly reject, yet it also provides an explanation for the production of new things in time and history that would be impossible, as Ted rightly says, if God indeed withdraws. This is power manifest as love. As God gives God's self away, God empowers us. So I'm basically saying here yes and no to Ted's observations. I do agree that kenosis understood as withdrawal creates the problem that you're suggesting exists at the higher level of nature in Gregerson's presentation. But if we retrieve a radical form of kenosis, understood not as withdraw, but self-emptying into the world, namely a kenosis of the Father, I think it